is a beautiful place, I know. If you want to go to heaven on time, do by your neighbor like you do by yourself. Heaven is a beautiful place, I know.
My first paid job in Murrells Inlet, I was working for Miss Lucy and Jim Bailey at the old Sunnyside restaurant. I started there washing dishes. I was 9 years old. And after I left there, my daddy took me in the creek with him one time to pick oyster, and ever since I wet my foot in that water the first time, I never left this marshland since. I was going in this creek ever since. When I first started flounder gigging, I was 9 years old. I went with my daddy. He had a flat-bottom wooden boat, what they call flat-bottom skiff back in the days. We used to go in what we call the bay, right over there, that Drunken Jack Island, right on. We used to go in the bay flounder gigging with what we call a flambeau. Flambeau is a kerosene, a little, got a kerosene little can on top, a 3/4 inch pipe coming on with a cut-off valve, sticks out. Well, back in the days, kerosene had so much octane in it, it would burn like gasoline. So that's what we used when we first started. But before then, the Waccamaw Indian taught the black people how to flounder gig with what we call a wharf pan. It sat on your boat and it burned fat lighted knot. And from the flame of the fire, you could see the flounder under the water on what they call dark night. Dark night means when the moon breaking up, everything is black dark. That's the best time to go flounder gigging.
27 tribes of native peoples were on this Gullah Geechee corridor from North Carolina to Florida. 27 tribes of people. So that's your bedrock. And we cannot forget that. And so all we are is this melding and changing and creating of new culture. We are all part of who we were when we came from wherever our ancestors came from. And then we are all the new people that were created when all of those people came here to create, a new life. And so there's a lot of melding of culture, but a lot of West African dominance in this area simply because we were the vast majority for such a long period of time. I don't want people to get used to this kind of a Disney perception of real life places that were created by real life people under real life circumstances. And the challenge will be to figure out how these stories then help those communities continue to stay communities with their own unique culture, and how those stories can then help other people understand why these places existed and the influences and impact those places had on the rest of the country and the rest of the world.
One of the first times I remember was being out, and it was during time of World War II when they had the crash boats in Murrells Inlet, because they had what is now the Myrtle Beach Airport was in a place where they were practicing firing at targets, and the targets were over on Garden City. And we were out in a boat, and all of a sudden you never knew when they were going to come and practice. And we were out there and they started firing. So we had to get in as fast as we could, because they saw our boat and we could have been hit.
Back in the 60s, there were 2 yellow barracks, right there, Army barracks. Me and my brother, oldest brother, Tom Jr., my cousin James Nesbitt, and Joe Vereen Sparkman, we tore those 2 Army barracks down back in the 60s, right here. All this here was a big mud flat. The only big headboat beating here was the Thunderbird #1. Captain Buddy Dew bought the Thunderbird #2 in 1960-something. He had 3 engines. He took one engine out, the middle engine, left the starboard and the port engine, because fuel was so high back then.
In the early days, people had these big rowboats, and they had a man that would row. And in those days, boats didn't have to be registered, but everybody had their initials, the man's initial on the front of the boat. Like my grandfather's name was John Gasquey, and he had J-O-G on the front of his boat, so he could identify his boat. And they'd row out, fish, and then they'd row back in. Or they'd row out to what is now Garden City. There was nothing over there. They'd go over there and spend the day, have a picnic.
My first memories would be, probably 62, 63. And it was paradise. And that little island over there I called it Granny's Island. As kids, we'd walk across. You could actually walk across at low tide, get on it, and we would think we were somewhere in Africa.
We used to go fishing on the Ann Howe just because it was next door at the Oliver's Lodge. And we didn't do so much deep sea fishing as we did fishing around the inlet, staying inshore.
When I started picking oyster in 1959, I started picking oyster in 1959. For DJ Nance, that was old man Hobby Nance's son. When I first started picking oyster, we was getting 90 cents a bushel. And I picked for him until he passed away. Then I started picking oyster for his daddy, old man Hobby Nance. I picked oyster for him. I worked for him until he passed. I went to his son, Paul Nance. And I ran the oyster business there at Nance's Creekfront Restaurant for 25 years. I ran that business for Paul Nance. And from then to now, back in the days, we didn't have much boats, diesel engine and gas engine out in this inlet. We used to go out there and pick 80, 90, 50 bushel a tide. But since all the gas engine and diesel, really, that's what killed a lot of our product in the marshland, fuel. And the product, we got a good product, but it's not as much as it been back then. But a person still can go out here and make an honest living.
Well, I go back a long ways. I was Mr. Wilcox's, one of his early patrons as far as the Hermitage goes. My father was a friend of Mr. Wilcox's, and he worked for him in Marion when he was a child. And we would come down and sit at the Hermitage on the porch, and he would tell us about, naturally, Alice and other stories about the inlet. And we would go crabbing right over here on the government dock, about halfway out in between the stations where the boats dock. And I remember crabbing there when I was about 6 years old. So that was my first memories of the inlet.
1967, about June, I was fortunate enough to have a job at the Air Force Base Marina, right up the street from here. And every morning I would get up before daylight and go to all the seafood markets and get flounder heads for crab bait and come down to the docks, and there'd be 60 crab traps on the docks ready for me to take yesterday's bait out and put today's bait in, flounder heads. And as the tide came in, I would go out on the inlet, take 30 traps at a time and spread them out in the proper places. And we caught many, many crabs, and we sold them for $1.75 a dozen, and the locals thought we were too high.
So my first memory in Murrells Inlet was I was probably 5 years old, and I went oystering with my father and a guy named Too Tall Willie, and we picked a lot of oysters. Of course, I didn't do much of it, but we picked a boatload. These days, my favorite thing about being in the creek is taking my children out, letting them swim, play, build sand castles out at the point. they're finally old enough where we can go do a little bit of fishing. So we like to go out and mess around. I took my son just a couple months, probably a month ago, and caught his first fish, and then he managed to catch 18 more after that, 5 years old.
You know, walking down toward the inlet when Dad's head boat was coming in, seeing the boats, all the people that were waiting for them to unload the fish, and you know, just really the excitement that it would build, the smells that would be involved with the, you know, the noise from the engines, and just all the fun stuff as a kid. You're like, wow, you know, this is pretty special. You know, it was not unusual to have 200 to 300 people out there watching the boats come in. The Capt Mallocks came to the inlet in 1967, and you know, I just remember there were several head boats. You had the Captainville, you had the you know, the New Inlet Princess, a lot of these boats that were going and fishing and you know, running head boats, whether it be full day or half day, and gosh, it just seemed like there were probably at least a dozen head boats at that point. Plus you had your charter boats that would go, you know, more for the sport fish, like, you know, the swordfish or sailfish and marlin, that kind of thing. So there were a good many charter boats at that point too, you know. And then you mixed in the commercial fishermen that were going out, and didn't seem to be quite as many back in that day. There were more head boats, and then it kind of transitioned a little bit to more of the commercial fishing boats that would go out for multiple days at a time. And then now, you know, just coming back to the being out in the inlet more, and you're just seeing fewer and fewer of the boats that are actually making their living off of what we do here in Murrells Inlet. So.
I was in my teens the first time I went out in the inlet. Used to hang out with a buddy of mine named Bud Rowe. He showed me the creek for the better part of the 3 years we fished together. We started off together. He showed me how to tie my knots and stuff like that. So we go out in the creek and pick oysters and clams and have you know, steam the oysters and make clams casinos and fun stuff like that with the food. We used to go, we still do, go dive the jetties for flounders and stuff like that. Free dive and shoot it when it's clear. That's fun stuff, and good eating, of course.
I love just seeing all of the different species, the baby flounder that float around, and you can see them grow over time. I love being able to go out there freely and paddleboard and look into the water and see how clear it is, because that's something that brings people in, not even just locals, but tourists.
I moved here in 1980 just to stay for one summer. And of course it was the rush of the summer crowd and everything, and I decided to stay. It didn't hit me until about 3 years in how precious this place was. There was no place like it. It was quiet. The people here were lovely. I had a way to make an income that I enjoyed and was proud of. I waited tables for a lot of nice people in a lot of nice places, served some amazing food.
My first memory was meeting my son, who was going to Georgetown Horry Tech for lunch at one of the restaurants along the Marsh Walk. Not that long after it was developed, and it was calm, it was peaceful. A person that looked like a grandfather with his grandson came up in a boat and tied up, and I said, this is just ideal. This is just an ideal. The nature and the establishments along the Marsh Walk was very impressive to us. Where it was originally intended to improve the economy and give the opportunity to appreciate the nature, I don't see the nature element as much as we used to. That part of it is not balanced with the economic aspects.
I had been to Murrells Inlet with my family for a family vacation last summer actually, and we stayed and we enjoyed the marsh walk. But the first time I ever went out to the marsh was the beginning of the semester. I guess one of my favorite parts about it is what I know it provides to the community.
Yeah, I think that people don't, if they don't understand that we see value in where we are, then it's easy for them to think that there's nothing really here of value except for me and my and my stuff and my new ideas and my concepts. When people see things that are not developed, or they see things in their natural state, sometimes people think we need to do something with that. And you don't always need to do something with things that don't have man-made structures on it. Everything doesn't have to be a thing. I mean, it was a thing before you got here. You see what I'm saying? And so I think that, yes, people have, and in a lot of cases, like I said, we have allowed it because we didn't stand firm in our understanding of ourselves and our region.
Meeting people here in the early days was so easy, and that small community feeling is something that I have always loved and appreciated about Murrells Inlet. You know, and I was a newbie back then, so all the people that it seems like working in the kitchens, they're generational, you know, people. They've been here for generations and generations. They taught me a lot about local things, local cultural heritage, the Gullah language. Herman Carr at Russell's, for example, would yell at me when my food was up and late in Gullah, and that was my first experience. And here I am, 19, going to Coastal, and I had no clue what he was saying, but so he introduced me to the whole world of Gullah. And kind of from there is probably where a little bit of my interest in history began.
My first memories being in Murrells Inlet is coming down to Murrells Inlet with my family and hanging out at the creek and the restaurants and going to church actually in Murrells Inlet, and just spending time here collecting wood, but also just playing in the creek and hanging out with friends after church and visiting with families. I'm Gullah Geechee, and most people don't associate Murrells Inlet with Gullah Geechee, but it is. Because if you're African American and the plantations that are originally in this area, you're Gullah Geechee. And we're tied to the crabs, the crabbing, fishing, oyster harvesting. I remember going out and crabbing on a Saturday afternoon with my mother. And crabbing to us wasn't a meal, it was dessert. We would take it back home and eat the meal, then have the crab for dessert that we recently just got out of the creeks that morning. So the history of it is not just my family history, but it's community history. Having the crab cracks, the fish fries on Friday, the oyster roast, and to this day, we still have those, not as frequently as before, but I just remember growing up and really enjoying what I caught and eating it at home. We were the cooks. We added the special seasoning. That's why it became the seafood capital of the world. And, you know, there's no other flavor to it. We took what was in the water naturally and we added all of those seasonings that we found out in the woods or that were passed down along to us from West Africa.
Whoa, God, young lady, this place changed in just the last 25 years.
In that movement in shallow water, you would see sea creatures, shrimp, fish, crabs, occasional squid would squirt ink and vanish out of the picture. When I came back here in 2001, I did the same thing as I had done as a child, where the bottom was full of life. And what I observed on coming back was a moonscape. There was no life. The bottom had flattened out. The sandbars that we used to know as children had disappeared. The wave action, and this is only my opinion, but I think it's a pretty darn good one, is that this wave action from all these boats had flattened everything out. It pretty much erased these sandbars, these navigation tools I used as a youngster to get in and out of the creek had disappeared. Now it was just a flat, void bottom.
So this marsh goes back long before any of us were here. And its use, the way that people were using it, we see a lot of subsistence fishing, we see a lot of small scale commercial fishing, recreational fishing, paddling, bird watching, and this all contributes to the identity, the cultural identity of the people of Murrells Inlet, the people of this area who have memories and have history and family traditions of interacting with the marsh in that way. And as the marsh changes over time and the biodiversity suffers, the water quality suffers, and it begins to change, we begin watering down that cultural relevance and that cultural tie to one of the greatest resources that is really the landmark of Murrells Inlet.
Africans have always been seafaring people. Africans have always been fishing and water people. Murrells Inlet and the relationship that many African Americans have to the water is they made their living and interacted with the water in respectful ways. Just like indigenous people all over the world, they interact with the things and the places that feed them, clothe them, house them in respectful ways. There is abundance in the world. It's just a matter of how we divvy stuff up and how we treat the land that God gave us.
Sustainable development encompasses people and the economy and our natural resources. When we talk about people, culture, heritage, our history, that's the critical component for people. And particularly in Murrells Inlet, with such a long history as a fishing village, with such a long history of Gullah culture, such a long history here in South Carolina, but also a very important aspect of that history is the economic development of the inlet. And so preserving the inlet has everything to do with preserving the history and the heritage, particularly the Gullah heritage, which now we're part of a heritage corridor. So that's the critical question for sustainable development. And protecting the estuary has to be done because we are nestled within that estuary. Sustainable development has to find some type of balance that satisfies the needs of protecting our heritage, our people, and our culture, and at the same time providing a livelihood from them that is hopefully dependent mostly upon local resources like the wonderful shellfish, oyster beds that we have, fishing that we have, as well as the migratory bird species that we can look at that we know are changing because our climate is changing. And so it's being able to look at the baseline data of our changing environment here at the estuary and then nestle ourselves within it, because as people, we are part of that ecosystem and we are dependent upon it.
When I retired, I had the opportunity to join the water monitoring group. My background in education is in environmental engineering and science, and particularly in water quality. So it was a special interest area for me. Our whole economy and the whole reason that Murrells Inlet is such a popular and wonderful place it is the estuary. I mean, if it were to be degraded, suffer something similar to Chesapeake Bay, tourists would stop coming, sports people would stop coming, and our economy would grind to a halt. And we can't allow that to happen. So we need to be proactive. We need to think in a forward direction and be protective as much as we can.
My concern is development. I'm very worried about wetland development and what's going to happen when we don't have these natural buffers and these natural carbon sinks in our community.
I hope it don't change no more what it is, because Murrells Inlet done changed so much now. I born and raised, I get lost from it. I do. I get lost from it now. No, it's building up too fast. But we know we got to move it project, but we ain't got to move that fast in it.
Right now, the commercial fishing community is facing unprecedented challenges when it comes to recognizing how do we interact with a resource that is constantly changing. The resource that we see here behind me is being threatened by multiple user groups trying to take advantage of it and use it in ways that aren't necessarily conducive to the most natural and sustainable practices that we need to see flourishing ecosystems.
Commercial fishermen and all fishermen in general are really stewards of the resource. They care about it, so they don't want to deplete it terribly.
One of the most helpful species that we see in this estuary are oysters. And what's so great about oysters is they're a keystone species. So just their existence alone in a habitat helps create a more flourishing habitat for the other species that rely on that ecosystem. When we take a look at salt marsh integrity surveys, we're looking at the biodiversity of the fish and the birds that are living in that habitat, as well as the vegetation. When we see fluctuations of the vegetation or the birds or the fish, then we start seeing an ecosystem that is in flux. And when we have climate change as a pressure, then we begin to recognize that the sediment that is accruing on the marsh surface may not be keeping up with local sea level rise.
Well, you go fishing, you come back with all you could eat, because we didn't have freezers and that back then. So you just either you ate them for supper or you shared them with your neighbors. And then we loved to go shrimping. That was fun at low tide. And we'd go out, and our favorite places to go was right over here at Timber Landing, which is right over here. You go at low tide and you pull the net, and we'd bring in 50 pounds of shrimp with 2 or 3 pulls. Now you go over there and you probably wouldn't get 2 or 3 shrimp. It's just, I don't know what's happened. Pollution, I guess.
I'm concerned about the rate of development in the watershed itself. And just in the 16 years that we've lived here, there's been enormous growth. And of course, we were one of them that moved here, and I don't fault, anyone else. But it seems like we're moving from a primarily single family, low density to higher density. And I just don't know how much of that intense development the estuary can tolerate. What hasn't been a focus area is what effect it has on the environment. EPA, for example, says that when your impervious surfaces, those are the ones that the water runs off, that doesn't soak into the ground. When those surfaces exceed 10% of your total land, that the water quality begins to be impaired. And we can't tolerate a loss of water quality, due to development or other man-made reasons. There's nothing we can do about the wildlife, but there's a lot we can do about how we use the land, and that's what we have to balance with economic growth.
The estuary health is critical for coastal resilience along the coast of South Carolina. Murrells Inlet is a perfect example of a historical town that has a critical place in our history, but also in our future, because the estuary protects us from flooding. The estuary cleans our water. The estuary provides us with food, and the estuary is part of our culture. There's really no other emblem around the world that is more significant in terms of sustainable development.
Well, I really wish people nowadays knew exactly the history behind our creek in Murrells Inlet and where we are now today. I just wish people knew old Murrells Inlet the way it used to be, when we were growing up. That creek's put a lot of people through college and hard winters and basically a livelihood. One of my biggest concerns is people not taking care of the resource. There's tons more people that live in Murrells Inlet now, and I just feel that eventually it get to the point where it may get overfished.
The clam industry, for example, I remember when I first got here, in a 10 square yard area of marsh, I could harvest a bushel of clams in less than a half hour. Now you really got to scratch hard to get a half a bushel of clams all over the damn place. So it's there's way too many people using the resource. It's a finite resource, and DNR and all the regulators and all the local enforcement needs to realize that the state of the resource has to come first.
So oysters offer a host of ecosystem services, and this is from providing anything from habitat to filtering the water. And when oysters have been overharvested and these natural reefs are decimated, then they can no longer contribute to these benefits that they often offer for the habitat. And this means that there could be ecosystem or changes in ecosystem patterns in the fish that inhabit the estuaries. It could be change in marsh, because wild reefs or natural reefs provide marsh stabilization and can contribute to erosion if those oyster reefs aren't there. And also it can lead to increased pollutants and nothing to filter those pollutants from the water, causing things like eutrophication, added nutrients, and hypoxic and anoxic conditions, which are devastating to all wild habitats.
The favorite thing about an estuary to me is just knowing that it's like a nursery of the seas. When I learned that 75% of all the fish and shellfish that we consume every year get their start in an estuary, it just blew my mind. I thought, wow, 75%. Crabs, shrimp, various fish species. So, very important habitat and needs to be kept clean and healthy.
Tommy Chandler passed away, and I went to work for his brother, Bill Chandler, in 1993. And working with Mr. Bill Chandler, I learned a lot from that man over the years, because he was an engineer. And he taught me a lot of things I didn't know over the years. And I appreciate him for everything what he done for me. And like I said, me and Mr. Bill done work for the state to keep oyster and stuff in Murrells Inlet going like it's supposed to be. But so far, we got a pretty good stock of oysters in Murrells Inlet over the years by doing the right thing. Don't over-harvest your bed. You got to manage your bed just like you manage your house. You know what I mean? You start letting people go in and call yourself being a good Samaritan, then they're going to take somebody else. Then it's out of proportion. So the best thing to do, manage your oyster bed right, do the right thing, and we always will have self-peace in Murrells Inlet.
Here at Coastal, I'm a sophomore, and my concentration is science and ecosystems. For our project here in Murrells Inlet, we tried to do a comprehensive study of the social, economic, and environmental pillars of sustainability here in the community and assess what we can do and what needs to be done in order to provide a sustainable future for the community. So we found a lot from different areas of our study. We found that there is a high flood risk for Murrells Inlet. We found that the environment is experiencing degradation, but that it is still fixable. It's still manageable, and we can still make a difference here.
Without healthy waters, we cannot have healthy people, we cannot have healthy communities. So it is vital that we maintain the quality of the waters. It impacts the seafood, and if we can't eat the seafood, it's going to negatively impact our culture, because we're just inherently embedded in that water. Not only fresh water, but the ocean water. And not only does it provide us sustenance, but it literally feeds our culture.
We welcome visitors. The inlet provides us with a lot of income. We welcome our visitors, we love our visitors, but we do not like the plastic. We have to educate people to not create litter.
Plastic pollution is one of the greatest and most concerning environmental issues of our time, and we have to move on this. We cannot afford to wait and see what happens. Just getting people out in nature and seeing, when you look out into the marsh right now, it looks healthy and clean, but boy, when you start picking up trash and you really understand the pressure that plastic is putting on these waters. One thing that's important for people to understand, the big litter is important to remove because that's breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces, but the small litter, the cigarette butts and the tiny little fragments, that's really important because so many critters that are in the food chain are really small and they're consuming that small stuff. So we count each debris. Well, 100 beer cans looks very different than 100 cigarette butts in terms of weight and volume, but they're equal in in danger to the marine environment.
Our bees out there from September 15th to May 15th, 9 months a year, harvesting shellfish. The trash, plastic bags, chairs off of people's docks. You got garbage cans, all that in the marshland. Come off of people's docks and stuff. And it's getting worse and worse. You can go in Murrells Inlet now and put 5 dumps in, you will fill them up in one day. Every year, spring tide, they goes out here, they clean Murrells Inlet, and that's a good thing.
So I took in Hugo on the beach in Myrtle Beach. That was quite an experience. But when I did move here, I got a job as a waiter at what was then the Anchor Inn. And in the course of working that winter, and obviously the restaurants aren't so busy, or they weren't then in the wintertime, I spent a lot of time on the second floor looking through the windows and just observing the marsh, which I loved. And at that time, the marsh was full of everything from steel shelving to 5-gallon white buckets to pieces of roof to dishwashers sticking out of the mud. I mean, it was an unbelievable mess. And it just came to me like an epiphany with all the people that I'd gotten to know and all the people that they knew, that if we all got together one day and had all the equipment and everything donated for the day, that by God, we could do it. And we did. We had 600 people out in the creek. And that was called Spring Tide, and we're about to have in this next April, we will have the 30th Spring Tide. I really couldn't be happier about that.
Good morning, Spring Tide!
What I would like to do today, on behalf of the South Carolina House of Representatives, present you with a resolution honoring you, the event, and all the thousands of volunteers that have taken part of this over the years. So thank you. It's such a great event because those of us who have been in Murrells Inlet and grew up playing in the creeks of Murrells Inlet, you know, understand what the growth and all the area, the impact that it's having. You know, it's every day I'm out there picking up trash. It's just not one day. But the inlet is a great place as we look at the families that have grown up here and have stayed here, that migrate to the creek. Now people from out of the area are starting to discover what we've known for years. But it's important that we protect it, that we keep it like it is, and you know, for the next generations like us, I've got generations coming up now, and for their kids, that we continue to enjoy what you and I have always enjoyed.
That creek out there is for everybody. Ain't no one person on that creek. It's for every person who want to go to enjoy life the right way. All you got to do is give respect and you receive respect.
The climate change and the rise in sea level is going to be a major thing on this coast and probably all coasts.
The marsh, if the marsh has room to migrate, it will migrate. I mean, the salt marsh is always moving. It's always in flow and structure, back and forth, and a lot of that's weather dependent. But if there's room for the marsh to move upslope, it will, and that's a natural occurrence, and that's a healthy thing. But if there's no room to move and there's no way to go for it to move vertically as well, because of lack of sediment that's been trapped and bound to the plant life, then essentially everything you see that has a lot of cordgrass and black needle rush, etc., it's just all going to be water.
So I'm a coastal marine geologist. We work a lot of offshore, but also on projects along coastlines. And since about 10 years, we work on sea level rise and land level lowering issues in different parts of the world. I joined Coastal Carolina University some 6 years ago, and when I found out how beautiful the coasts are here, but also how great the demand of smarter solutions, of scientific information is, it was a very easy decision to accept the position here. I think it would be smart and of course also more resilient to develop plans which really take, focus on the preservation of the remaining wetlands, of the remaining nature here, because we know very well that, what we see here, the marshes and so on, they are, we call it the natural first line of defense. So we don't need to spend money, it is just here. If we construct something, if we change something here, either we dig something, we dredge, or we fill it in and we lose the wetlands. The consequence always is new costs coming up to maintain a system, stationary, an environment which is dynamic. So if we look at a system like Murrells Inlet, which we call a beach barrier system, there's the barrier island with the beaches facing the ocean, and behind it there's the estuary, and they depend on each other. So they cannot exist independently, they need each other to really form a stable environment. That the beach can basically keep up with the rising sea level by just rolling over and shifting the barrier island a little backward and a little higher. So that is a natural process. Unless we build any kind of constructions or infrastructure on that. The infrastructure is stationary. The barrier islands are naturally the most dynamic environments we know along our coast.
I guess the biggest concern is really sea level rise. Estuaries are important in the sense that I always tell people there's three main things or benefits from estuaries, or three descriptors, and that is filter, sponge, and nursery. If estuaries don't have a way to move, the salt marshes, if they can't rise in vertical because they're not getting enough sediment trapped, and if they can't go upslope because they're up against the maritime forest, then the estuaries and the salt marshes will just be all water. Saltwater intrusion is an issue over time. I mean, we see up and down the coast where saltwater has claimed trees. There's trees right behind me you can see that have been lost to saltwater intrusion over many years. Some plant life is more salt tolerant than others. Certainly a lot of the trees that you see along the maritime forest can take some salt. They get some salt pruning, certainly from the winds that come off the shore. But eventually it's going to claim a lot of these trees. A lot of them are live oaks.
It really worries me that after Hurricane Hugo, a lot of houses ended up in the creek, and there were very few on the beach. Today it is lined with houses. It worries me that a lot of those houses will be out here in the marsh.
Well, the main thing I'm worried about is overbuilding and the watershed. And I mean, it's amazing that Murrells Inlet can still, you can still eat the oysters and clams in Murrells Inlet. You can't in Pawleys Island, hadn't been able to in a long time. But that the watershed and contamination, pollution coming from development on the other side of the highway, that worries me the most.
First of all, we need to tap the brakes on gentrification. We just need to tap the brakes, okay, and learn the lessons from places like New Orleans and other places that have just let it run rampant. People who are in political office and in leadership roles need to understand that there needs to be a balance between what is new and coming in and the preservation of what is old and the significance of that. Also, people need to stop acting like science don't exist. We need to stop acting like things are all right.
There are enough people here that are concerned that they're going to make a difference. How much, I don't know.
The thing that concerns me that has clearly changed in the short time that we've been here is I'm not seeing the local leaders stepping forward like we have in the past. And we need people, younger people from our community, to step up into those leadership positions, and really make a difference and provide the guidance for others. Well, there's a lot of folks here that are very concerned, like we all are, and they turn out for meetings and voice their concerns. And I think that element is growing. People are becoming more aware. They're seeing more land, cleared virtually every month, and are realizing that this just can't go on at this pace. So I think what we need to do is we need to change, take a hard look at our zoning ordinances, change them to meet future needs, not the past needs, and make the changes in terms of a vision that sees long-term health and prosperity both for the inlet and the communities that surround it.
We've lost a ton of working waterfront, so we don't have anywhere to keep our boats. We don't have anywhere to put fuel on them. We don't have anywhere to put ice on them and then pack the product out. Well, my biggest concern about the future of the inlet and the health of the species that live out there would be, just the illusion of plenty. That there's a lot of pressure out there. The fish especially never get a break, but the inlet never gets a break either because of all the runoff and pollution that goes into it. It's just a matter of time before it gets below a critical point to where it won't be able to come back, and it turns into the Dead Sea. May not be anytime soon, but throughout my life I've seen it change a lot.
As people who are concerned about your community in your area, I think that we need to listen to those people who make their living and off the land, those people who have a respect for land and water. We need to listen to what they are saying. We need to listen to those people who love this place and who depend on this place for their living because they know it like the back of their hand and they love it, like their own. So what they say and what they observe is very important.
Well, if you don't take care of it, we ain't gonna have it long. But if you do the right thing, we got a place where we can enjoy our kids, grandkids, and many more days to come.
I think if you love Murrells Inlet, and if you love this area and all the beauty that it has, which is really, I think, and my father told me this as a child, that you can travel the world, you're never gonna find a more beautiful place than where we live. And he's right.
Hey, you've got a voice, and what you say matters, You have this opportunity to speak out, and if you can see that something is not right, and it's obviously affecting the wildlife, the birds, the ducks that migrate here. I mean, it's an estuary for everything, for all of our shrimp, for our grouper, flounder. And if we don't turn around and protect this beautiful place, well, then inevitably we're affecting so many species. It's like I said, it's the birds, it's the offshore fishing. Everything begins in this little nursery behind me.
But I really want to hold out for my kids and grandkids. I want them to experience the same activities and the same resources and environment that we have.
My hopes for the future of Murrells Inlet is, just that people would make an effort to leave it like they found it, make it better than it was even when they found it.
And I want you to realize that there's a beautiful life going on underneath that water and that we need to try to protect it for future generations. With development going on like it is, with the watershed issues that we have, with the oyster beds declining, and as they're our #1 filterers out there. They can filter up to 50 gallons a day, but how much work can oysters do to prevent all that we're doing on the mainland?
We need to go ahead and manage this estuary and every estuary in South Carolina to be the most productive that it can be.
There are so many solutions around the world, and we need to be open to those. We can have a sustainability ordinance in Georgetown County. We can have one in our state. We can start planning based on science. We can start collaborating with developers. We can start collaborating with businesses, and we can start collaborating with just general citizens to create policies that enhance our fish stocks, that allow our oyster beds to flourish and be restored, that take away the pollutants, the lack of pH level, the turbidity, and the E. coli that we know is in our water quality studies. We can do this by making simple changes like protecting from stormwater runoff, like low impact development, like not clear cutting when we don't have to, like not clear cutting down to the edge of the water because we know those grasses clean the water. If we are just open to collaborating and creating new policies that allow the estuary to flourish, it can be here.
As far as the oysters go, we recycle our shells. I've replanted many of oyster shells here in Murrells Inlet, and I'll continue to do that in the future. So I just hope that we can maintain the quality, the water quality, and the cleanliness of the creek.
I think hopes for South Carolina marshes would come through education in teaching people how the interactive cycles go and things that may affect South Carolina marshes, certainly stormwater runoff from all of the development that's going on, impervious surfaces increasing. That means a lot more runoff, and nutrients in that runoff is going to run into the marshes. As I said earlier, they act as a filter and a sponge, but they can be overtaxed with too much development. It's important to be mindful of little things that you can do in your backyard in terms of limiting the amount of fertilizer that you use, making sure that you pick up animal waste, litter certainly, but anything that falls into that stormwater runoff is going to end up in our waterways.
Ecosystem health and human health are intrinsically linked. You cannot separate those two. And if we continue to pollute nature, to pollute the waters that we're eating oysters and shrimp and crab from, that we get half of our oxygen on the planet from the ocean. If we keep polluting these ecosystems, and they're just going to break down in health, and ultimately so will we. There are wildlife health concerns, but there are human health concerns here as well.
The inlet will survive without humans, but humans will not survive without the inlet.
Being out in this area and this lifestyle becomes a part of you. And I may not be from here, but it's become my second home, and I will do the best I can to explain that and let others know that it's important to protect what can't fight for itself.
This salt marsh is a one of a kind, and it's delicate.
It would be a disaster if that was gone. We have to maintain something for our kids. I mean, we're thinking not only the end of our lives, but our kids, and if they have kids, their kids. I mean, what are they going to look at?
You know, you got a lot of people still care about this little fishing village. One thing I know, I'm born and raised here. I worked all my life. I don't drink, I don't smoke, and I'm happy. As long as I can get out there and fish, I'm happy as the peas in a pot. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I'm born and raised here. I'm gonna die here in this marshland.
If you wanna go to heaven on time, Dubai, you live like you do by yourself. Heaven is a beautiful place.